My name is John Lee with Internet Associates, and I am here to introduce another member, or really our current chair of our Federal IPv6 task force. I've known Kevin now for probably 5 or 6 years. He became the IPv6 transition manager for NASA after the 2010 memo. Prior to that, or continuing with his day job, he has been working with high-performance computing at NASA, a number of internet initiatives and other things. He got a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science from Berkeley, and then he got his Master's in Systems Management from the other Notre Dame. Apparently there's one near here. So without further ado, let me introduce Mr. Kevin Jones.
Good afternoon, everyone. As John mentioned, I'm currently the chairperson. That's actually a new thing, probably as of this Monday. Our chairperson, Bobby Flame from the FBI, just recently retired. He did his 20 years and exited stage left. So I'm now the new chairperson and actively looking for a replacement vice chair. I'm also the NASA IPv6 transition manager. That was definitely something that I think I got caught when everybody was taking a step backwards, left across the line, and I ended up dealing with that as well. So in terms of the presentation, I was asked to give kind of an update on what was going on a federal level, as well as giving an update of what specifically is going on with NASA. So in terms of the structure of this presentation, it's more giving the federal update and interjecting the NASA status as we go along with that. So back in September 28, 2010, there was a new OMB memo came out for IPv6 and gave us some new goals. I actually think this was an improvement on the IPv6 activities that were taking place prior to that. There was a memo that preceded this in 2005, and I think once this memo came out and we got re-engaged, we saw that a lot of things that happened in 2005 or even in 2008, where the agencies were asked to demonstrate that they could pass traffic, they did whatever they had to do to meet that requirement, and they pretty much stopped. There wasn't a whole lot of continuity or continuing that effort after that. So the 2010 memo, even though if you compare the two, the 2005 was this very formal memo that actually got a designation and had a lot of review, there's been a lot more impact, I would say, from the 2010 memo. So there's 3 main goals in that. The first is the 2012 goal, which deals with enabling IPv6 for public services, so DNS, email, web, other IP services. And the purpose of that is just to make sure that citizen services are available via IPv6. I think that was a great goal, it's the right thing to do. For the 2014, kind of taking that from a different direction, basically saying if you have internal client systems that are internet capable and they can access public services, they should be able to do that, regardless of what protocol. So again, right goal. The third one actually is not related to implementation. It's based on ensuring that our purchases are IPv6 compliant. And that really comes from, I think you've heard this mentioned, that this is really an unfunded mandate. So no agency is getting any new allocations of funding to implement IPv6. And so from that, it's really important that the agencies leverage any opportunities for technology refresh as an opportunity to obtain IPv6 enabled infrastructure. So looking at the FY 2012 goal, there are, I'm sure, plenty of tools out there to do testing of public websites. I just list a few here. These are things that we use within NASA to do testing. And if you just simply go to these websites, you can punch in your website and see if it actually comes back and displays that your things are running with IPv6. But from a federal perspective, you might have heard a few people mention, I think John Kern mentioned the NIST Deployment Monitor yesterday. This is the tool that he was referring to, and it basically measures IPv6 status, not just for the government, but also measures it for universities and industry as well. So if you take a look at this, you've got a snapshot of where we are from the FY 2012 goal. You know, the colors are what you think they mean. Green is good, yellow's red is definitely has, it basically implements no progress. So if you, the thing is that for this goal, again, being unfunded mandate, this is actually, progress has been slow, but it's been noticeable. I think if you were to look at this snapshot, you would have actually seen agencies that just had red with actually no green whatsoever. But with this slow progress, we've seen every agency has at least done something. They've made some progress on this goal. You can't tell from this particular slide, but in the next slide, you can see that DNS is definitely the thing that agencies have made the most progress on. And then in terms of the domains that are assigned to each of the agencies, or the secondary domains that they're responsible for, there are a few that even have achieved 100%. It's a little asterisk there by NASA's name. We'll talk about that later. So again, for the USGV6 operational domains, you can look at the trend. This is the cool thing about the NIST Deployment Monitor, is not just the snapshots of that particular day, but there's also a history of what has been going on so far. So from a DNS perspective, you can see that the traffic is still on an upward trend, definitely for mail. I think when we first started out with the FY 2012 goal, a lot of agencies were having difficulties implementing specifically the mail. I think a lot of those issues have being resolved and are still on an ongoing basis. The only thing that's a little interesting here is if you look at the web, it looks like there's starting to be a little bit of a downward trend here. And not exactly sure what that's contributing to, but my guess is that this is actually might be related to another OMB initiative to move things to the cloud. And so I know we've had the previous presentations about making effort with IPv6 on the cloud services, but I think that's what we're seeing, is that we have sites that have been implemented with IPv6, and as they move to the cloud, some of them are losing their IPv6 status. So again, John mentioned yesterday in terms of the comparison of where we are from the US government versus industry. And I'm not going to show the snapshots that he was talking about of where there's bleeding red, but just in this overview, you can compare what's out there for IPv4, IPv6 for the US government. You can see for each of these, we're definitely leading for DNS, for web, and for mail. So there was also discussion of World IPv6 launch earlier by Veronica. So we had these two events back. June 6, 2011 was World IPv6 Day. That was a test where people committed to turn up IPv6 for a 24-hour period to test its IPv6 brokenness. That actually went well, so they decided to do it again the next year. We did World IPv6 launch. And people were challenged to actually turn it up and leave it up. It even had a tagline, "This time it's for real," right? But with those two events, there still are a very large number of public websites that don't have IPv6 enabled on them. In fact, I've been trying to just personally track this as the events that I attend. We have vendors that come to our center, Ames Research Center up the street, and they come and bring their information. I have been working with the coordinator for that event and trying to get word out to them about IPv6 even in advance of them coming, also checking their status. So I think this last event was one of the worst we had, where the only public enabled website was from GSA. So I still plan to follow up with the vendors and get that information out. But even at other conferences, NANOG, supercomputing, things that you would expect to see more IPv6 penetration in their public websites, the percentage is still pretty low. No, I'm talking about the vendors that are attending these events. Yes. So, so basically, so I just point this out. This because there are so many public websites that are still not out there from vendors, from universities, from what have you. Maybe it's time to look at doing another event. So I looked at what does it look like for this event, and I'm happy to say everybody that's on the agenda has a IPv6 enabled website. So I mean, this is information that I just pulled from one of the testers that I talked about earlier. It basically tests 5 different things as it relates to IPv6. Again, the important thing is that everybody here on the agenda, and that's from the events that I've been attending, that's a rarity. So a big hand to everybody that has got their website IPv6 enabled. But this is something that's easy to check. It takes seconds to do. And I think Joe had mentioned earlier that Ron Barosma's name from NREN, and he has that approach of if your website is not IPv6 enabled, that is a gating factor from whether they want to do business with you. They want to make sure that you can demonstrate your corporate commitment to IPv6 before they engage in conversation. So from a NASA perspective on the 2012 was our real, I would say, first really getting embraced from an headquarters perspective into the effort. A formal working group was created when this started. We even created sub-teams as needed. We had the web and applications group, routing, security. Later on, we discovered we also needed a procurement sub-team. We even have our internal website where we share information related to IPv6 that's available to everyone agency-wide. We just have a SharePoint for documenting things, guidance, presentations, action items. Each of the sub-teams has their own distribution lists. And then there was a IPv6 tracker just because we have so many public websites that were in scope of the FY 2012 effort. And then from a visibility perspective, I, as the IPv6 transition manager, do tag-ups with our the lead of the agency communications executive. And one of the things that each of the agencies are responsible for doing is reporting to OMB on a quarterly basis. And that's through something called the integrated data call. We decided that anytime we were sharing information with OMB, we would make sure that the CIO leadership team was getting that as well. So we started things just basically, and then in the first action, the project plan, that was actually something that was even required from OMB of each of the agencies. That project plan ended up boiling down to be something that was more of a checklist. So from my perspective at NASA, we have a bunch of different field centers. So I tried to mimic what OMB was looking for and asking the centers to follow along and do the things that were being requested on an agency level. So that included developing their teams, roles and responsibilities, stakeholders, et cetera. Also looking at IPv6 training. We started out where some centers thought they would do their own training. We later on ended up shifting towards trying to support training on a agency level. We also did an equipment audit, just really identifying where we were today in terms of having to leverage those technology refreshers. Which stuff is IPv6 capable, which one has partial IPv6 support, and which one is legacy. We tried to classify those, whether it was impacting the FY 2012 goal, the 2014, and if it impacted one of those, what was the plan to resolve it? We also had spent a lot of time working on IPv6 address plans. And a decision was made at this point to really focus on the public address space. So that's what was doled out for that. And then the address planning for the intranet actually continued. So basically, again, the scope for the 2012, from our perspective, this really was focused on things that are intended for use by the general public. So NASA has a database of this information, again, because we have such a large number of them. We use that to produce what websites were in scope. But this included using a SharePoint site and as well as a spreadsheet. The SharePoint was basically so that the centers could track their status. The spreadsheet enabled us to report on that status. One of the things that we found as we were getting close to wrapping this goal up is that new websites were being created, and we didn't have a process to ensure that those new websites were IPv6 enabled. So we had to actually go back and track all of the ones that were newly created and actually add those to the list for centers who had already considered themselves done and say, no, you're not done, you have to do these too. So we're actually right now looking at the possibility of adding that to the list of having a validation for when new websites are being created, although that's being challenging because there's some different databases that are being created and are currently in transition. So this is just an overview of where we are today on the FY 2012 goal. Made pretty decent progress. We're at 86%. Again, I think this is probably one of the largest number of public websites for the agencies. Over 1,000 sites, almost 900 of those implemented. And right now, we've only got one center that is still working to complete the FY 2012 goal. Of course, that center actually has half of our website, so it's understandable that they would still be working to complete that. But we're looking to wrap this up and actually reach 100% by August of this year. So I mentioned that there was an asterisk by NASA's name. We've actually been 100% on the NIST deployment monitor for quite some time. This snapshot actually dates back to September, I believe. But just recently, I think maybe 2 weeks ago, we discovered there was some routing issue that was preventing the NIST deployment monitor from reaching our website when you did a trace route. So NIST is actually working on this issue. They've reached out to both MAX and Internet 2, but that's giving us bad results. If you go and test NASA from any of those tools that are in the presentation, you should see that it actually comes up as working. So shifting to the second goal, the FY 2014 effort. Right now, I mentioned that the tracking status for the agencies actually occurs through the integrated data call. That's basically something that was created to try and minimize the impacts of OMB doing data calls on the CIOs, having it being more coordinated. But I think what ended up happening there is that the amount, even though it was coordinated and you knew when it was coming, the amount of questions started growing to the point of where the CIOs started pushing back and saying, hey, this is still too much. So recently there was an effort to remove questions from that, and some of that IPv6, just like anything else, was impacted. So right now, the thing that's left in that data call is the percentage for the FY 2012 goal, but unfortunately, the target date or even the challenges that the agencies are experiencing with trying to complete that goal are no longer part of that effort. Agencies definitely seem to be having more of an issue with the 2014 than they were with the 2012. We do know that at least one agency has successfully completed this, and based on the percentages that have been reported on the IDC, there's definitely a few others that are making pretty good progress on this. I've talked to a few different agencies just recently. I think that agencies are in the process, they're doing upgrading of infrastructure. We have an agency that basically made a decision since they were shifting to a new building, they would just make sure the new building was ready to run IPv6, and they expect that once they make that move, which is actually going to happen this year, they would reach 100%. We also have an agency that's done some tunneling, and they're working on trying to get some native connectivity. So again, there's testing tools here. Just you can test your desktop, see what score do you get. NIST also created a specific tool to test the various services. Whatever thing you're trying to test, you can test it out there. And then there was also this IPv6 Now website that actually mimics some of the things of some of the other test tools, but also has basic command line things that would be helpful for doing testing. So from a planning perspective, NASA has actually spent quite a bit of time working on IPv6 internet address plans, more time than we should have. We just recently got to a point of where some of the centers were approved. So that was a really big hurdle, and now we're hopefully ready to start getting going with our implementation efforts. Prior to that, centers were actually given action items as it relates to the local area network. From an implementation perspective, there's new guidance that is coming out. Just recently, there was an Internet standards document that was created that's currently out for review. There was a design document that mimics that, where you take a fictitious center and kind of do step-by-step instructions. And actually, just this week, there is a demonstration that's going to take place in our IPv6 working group meeting with the virtual tools that centers would have access to help them with their implementation efforts. So one of the challenges that we've had is NASA is actually undergoing a bunch of different various communications transformation initiatives. There's something called the Corporate Network Target Architecture, or CNTA for short, LAN compliance. So centers were basically having to make sure that their architecture aligned with the rest of the plan for the Communication Service Office. Our DDI manager has this term that she's invented, dynamic DHCP. She wanted all of the centers to align to that. Perimeter protections, there's VPN service, web content filters, perimeter firewalls. Corporate routing symmetry is a project that actually did get completed. Network access control. So these are all basically things that were being leveraged on the IPv6 project. In addition to that, DHS has a new continuous diagnostic mitigation project that is, the goal is to improve cybersecurity for the agencies. That's also having impact, and if all of that wasn't enough, there's new security governance changes that are underfoot that are impacting the project as well. So one of the things that is helping a bit is that there's a new CIO watch list for projects, and IPv6 was added to that, so it's getting a little bit more visibility than it had. But like I said, we're still in the early stages of implementation. Now that some of the address plans have been approved, the centers can kind of resume their effort on the FY 2014 goal. The other centers will have to continue to work through their dependencies and get their plans approved. We have a goal of trying to start some pilot activities this June, with the hope that these people, once implemented in the pilot, would stay on as early adopters. And so the optimistic goal is to try and have the centers with approved address plans actually move towards getting their centers completed by the end of August. And that's based, again, on this CNTA LAN compliance. That's a gating factor for getting your address plan. And unfortunately, for those centers that have not gotten their LAN compliance, we're still kind of trying to figure out what our overall target date for everyone is, because if you don't have LAN compliance, there might be some funding that's associated that hasn't been secured for that. So last goal, from an acquisitions perspective, NIST had created the USGV6 profile. This was done back in 2008. So you can go check that out. It's actually what we use in the government. You're welcome to use it as well. But basically, it creates a framework for how you specify requirements to vendors when you're actually trying to procure IPv6 capable equipment. There were 3 different profiles that were described in this document, putting requirements as whether it's a host, router, or network protection device. In addition to that, shortly following that, there was updates to the FAR, the Federal Acquisitions Regulation. And so that main policy requirement was that you had to put in your requirements for IPv6 into all of your purchasing unless this was waived by the CIO. So there were actually other clauses that kind of mimic that phrasing, but they basically are all saying the same thing. We need to continue to leverage these technology refreshes. You must actually specify IPv6 requirements when you're purchasing IP-capable IT. One of the things that Tony talked about yesterday was just, his impact while he was Federal CIO. This was actually one of the things that he impacted. We actually discovered that even though these things, July 28 for the USGV6 profile, 2009 for the FAR, a lot of the agencies didn't have their acquisition policies in place to ensure that their purchases were IPv6 compliant. So you had vendors saying, no, nobody wants IPv6, nobody's asking for it. So we actually created actions for the agencies to complete to make sure that they were actually following the intent of the FAR. The main thing was actually creating policies and doing that, recognizing that the IPv6 effort, which was generally run out of the CIO's office, if you're dealing with acquisitions, you obviously need to talk to acquisitions folks. So trying to make sure that the agencies were actually working with acquisitions when they were developing these policies. Creating contract clauses, making sure that there was IPv6 language that were going into all new contracts. Tony even wanted to go a step further and making sure if the contract had more than 3 years left, that those got updated as well. IPv6 compliance documents, touching all of our major contracts, and then announcing this stuff. If you're creating policies and not telling anybody, how good is that policy? So basically you had to create memos that it would announce these new policies. If you have people that are buying things, a lot of people may not have the idea of how to specify IPv6 requirements. So there was this idea that agencies should come up with some sort of baseline requirement so it's actually easier for a requester to make those requests to vendors. And then what are you actually doing to ensure these processes are working? How are you making sure that these policies are being implemented? So what forms, tools, or processes? And then the CIO waiver. That's actually specifically referenced in the FAR. A lot of agencies thought this was kind of if the CIO stamps it, but this actually needed to be formalized. So from an agency tracking, just from doing this, I think we started this towards the end of mid last year. But even getting more agencies on board with this, getting them to create these policies, we actually started seeing really good change with this. We created a stoplight chart to track where agencies were with their effort. We also tried to federalize this in the sense of if an agency had already completed an action, we took the things that were accepted, we categorized them by the action, and then any agency that still needed to complete that action could see what was already accepted and mimic their efforts after that instead of starting from scratch. So based on that, from a vendor perspective, we saw more and more vendors actually understanding what the USGV6 profile was. And part of our process includes getting products tested, getting a supplier's declaration of conformity. We saw more vendors being prepared to supply those. One of the things, at least for NASA, we wanted DHCPv6 added as a requirement, so we had people updating their testing and adding DHCPv6 to that. And then there were even just known known bugs that were sitting dormant, and actually getting these conversations and requests going got some of those fixed. So from a NASA perspective, we met all of these requirements. A lot of these requirements were generated based on what was done at NASA. So a lot of that stuff started back in early March. We created a formal procurement notice with the contract language. We developed our baseline requirements, formal CIO waiver. We have a form that you must use when you're doing a purchase request to make sure things are IPv6 capable. We haven't had it added language to all of our contracts. It's a process, but it's in our. We have an agency network services contract. We have an agency web services contract. IPv6 languages in those. We've also got it in our high-end computing contract. So We also created a user's guide, just because the process for the government in terms of following the requirements that we're expected to do to leverage these technology refreshes is not a simple process. So we actually created a user's guide to help us along. The user's guide contains a FAQ. It also has a applicability matrix that helps you determine whether an item is in scope or not, helps you determine whether the item should be treated as a host, router, or network protection device. It even has a template for how you should be communicating your requirements to the vendors, along with sample IPv6 contract clauses. And this is something we thought that was important enough that we would just agree that it would get updated as new information became available. So from a next steps perspective from NASA, there's definitely more contracts out there that we need to add IPv6 language to. The biggest one is our GWAC, the SOUP5. That's actually a contract that multiple agencies use. In fact, DoD uses that contract more than we do. Our desktop services contract, we'll continue to update the user's guide as necessary. We do have a waiver form, but we're even trying to improve that process. We want to make sure that right now, if you create a waiver, you don't really know where it is in the approval process. We're trying to solve that, create a workflow for that, as well as to create a database. So if you have an approved waiver, you don't actually have to create a separate waiver if you're purchasing something that is already under that waiver. We want to expand the communications of the policies. When we went to go announce these things, there was a decision made to kind of limit the announcement of these policies. But unfortunately, we don't have a distribution list for people who buy things, right? So there wasn't any way to reach everybody that's doing that. And so the consequence of not getting that out widely is that people are not really following the policies correctly. You're getting people who are trying to justify a single vendor or single product as opposed to including IPv6 requirements in the early part of their procurement and getting people to respond that actually have IPv6 capable products. Similarly, we're looking to do more outreach specifically for the people who are actually trying to help ensure these IPv6 compliance policies. So just to wrap this up, from a Fedv6 overview of where we are today, what we're doing next, we have monthly Fedv6 technical subteam meetings. Actually, John Lee, who's been doing a lot of the introductions and coordinations, is very heavily involved with that. It actually helps us secure the vendors for those meetings. We have a face-to-face meeting that happens twice a year that's put on by the outreach subteam. Todd Johnson is one of the co-chairs for that. In fact, our next one will be at GSA in June. We also have a OMB Max page where we keep track of our various presentations. We've actually done some serious work to actually go back and make sure we have the long history of Fedv6 tech subteam presentations as well as our face-to-face. The Fedv6 task force basically has been created to support the effort, working with the agencies, working with OMB and the Federal CIO leadership. And then we have various distributions for each of these groups. So one of the things that we've been working on from a Fedv6 task force perspective is there's potential that there'll be a new OMB IPv6 memo. Some stuff is just in the early stages, I would say. But really just, again, acknowledging that the goals that we had so far are actually the correct ones. We need to complete those. But I think moving beyond those to getting to a point of where we can get IPv6 everywhere in the infrastructure, and then even starting to figure out what are the right strategies for achieving the ultimate goal for IPv6 only. I think this conference has been great. There was a lot of discussion about the different ways to do that and really trying to think about what our role as the US government will be to help that along. Acquisitions. Doug Montgomery from NIST is working to update the USGV6 profile, various things, tweaking their core standards, Right now, there's no way to specify IPv6 requirements for applications and services, and they're trying to fix that. There's updates to firewalls and even adding information for IoT to the document. And then we're even taking a stab at trying to update the FAR, which is a pretty labor-intensive process, but trying to get actually stuff that would help us with the issue of getting vendor-specific requirements in there, so we're not faced with vendors not even being aware of what the requirements are. And then, as I alluded to earlier with the reporting, there's definitely an interest in reducing the burden of the agency CIOs for their reporting. So from an IPv6 perspective, there's an interest in trying to make the NIST deployment monitor be the kind of the de facto place for what the tracking of the FY 2012. That's going to take some work. I mean, it's already in existence, but the reality is, if you take an example of NASA that has over 1,000 public websites that are in scope, but we only have 4 secondary domains, there's a bit of a disconnect if you're going to use that as the tracking, and I don't think we're the only one that has that disconnect. So we're looking at ways to get the more comprehensive list of public websites that would be added to the NIST deployment monitor. For the FY 2014, that was actually something we were really struggling with in terms of how we would measure that status, because that's actually going into the internals of the agency's networks. But so far, it looks like the plan for this is to actually piggyback on the CDM effort that's being managed out of DHS. The idea is that there is going to be an agency dashboard that assesses their cybersecurity score, or whatever it is, on an agency dashboard. And then IPv6 is supposed to be added to that dashboard, so you can see the percentage of internal client systems that would be added, be implemented. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
So on the 2012 goal, back in the day, I remember it being rather specifically worded that it only covered websites that didn't require a username and password to get into them. Has there been any progress towards including all of those citizen services that actually require you to authenticate? Because I know several agencies at one point were going, oh, we'll just add free authentication so that the user has to sign up to use it, so we don't have to make it V6.
We had actually, even within NASA, had that definition for a while. That has gone away, at least from a NASA perspective, for quite some time. We've really shifted to everything that is intended for the general public is in scope. And we've tried to convey that in our Fedv6 face-to-face meetings, so don't know exactly how well that took in other agencies.
In making a comment on that, I believe it was refined to be if there was something that employees needed to log into, or or contractors, that was not the same as the general public. So even if you, as a general public, you had to log in, that I think went away as part of that redefinition a while back.
Yeah, and I mentioned that NASA had a database. We had groups of categories of people, businesses, industry, universities, and at first when we were starting, we just put if it said general public, but we realized that all of those other groups were part of the general public too, so all of that is included in our scope.
So far you've talked about pretty much all terrestrial stuff. Is there anything interesting going on in other areas?
I think we need to get our terrestrial stuff complete first.
I just asked.
Hi, Kevin. Since you're from NASA, I must ask, have you already allocated IPv6 prefix for Mars exploration?
No.
No. But okay, my serious question is actually on the security part. Is NASA gonna do something different IPv6 wise with the security this time? Or I'm not saying it's bad with IPv4, but we know there are bridges that've been reached. And is there something else that NASA planning to do differently with IPv6 security? You know, people usually expect from the federal government to be more secure than others. That's
Yeah, I wouldn't say that there's necessarily anything that's different. We may be slower to get there, but I think, from a security perspective, I mentioned the CDM effort. There are, even with the CDM effort, there are vendors that have started their IPv6 journey, if you will. They're still working to make sure that their security products have parity between IPv4 and IPv6, but they've already been selected, so we're going to work with them. We even have a few of them that are coming to present at our next face-to-face, but I don't think there's anything different, I would say, from that perspective.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, Kevin. So many federal organizations have computers that have static IPv4 addresses, and internal planning for IPv6, I know federal organizations still don't want to embrace DHCPv6. We've heard along this conference issues with Android and Slack support, or RDNSS. How does Android's support of Slack change what you may do internally?
So on the DHCP front, I don't know how big of an issue that is in other agencies. I know we have been working on that issue, and I think we're actually fairly close to having all of the centers do that. I think actually even this next month was the target date for, I think everybody's going to meet that except for maybe one center. In terms of the Slack, I'm not exactly sure where that's headed. I think our DDI manager has really been focused on everything must do DHCPv6, and I don't know if she thought she would just ban Android devices from our environment, but we really hadn't figured that quite out yet.
Okay.
Hey, Kevin. Kevin over here. John,
I'm sorry.
John, question for you. For either for you in NASA or across the larger program across the U.S. government, do you do any external monitoring and measurements of your websites? I'm familiar with many of the links that you showed, and known Doug for years, and a lot of it kind of at least from my understanding is like internal database of what does what in checking, right? So I'm guessing you're checking on net to other on net. Do you do any off net to validate measurements of your properties, right? Like nationalparkservice.gov, for example.
Not to my knowledge, but it doesn't mean it's not happening. I'm not in the web services group. I do know that GSA was talking about launching some sort of agency dashboard for websites, and I don't know if that was part of what they were planning to include. We were actually trying to see if it would be worth getting them to present, since our next face-to-face is actually at their location.
Yeah, so you should.
Okay.
So one of the things that we've noticed over the years, and it's not just with you, but we saw a lot of .govs have had oscillations in kind of v4 versus v6 performance, and you and I have a common interest, right? You have customers that happen to be a lot of my customers, right? So we have a vested interest to make sure that their experience is a proper one, right? So I think one piece of feedback I'll give to you is hey, that's a good opportunity for government and industry to potentially collaborate. We do a lot of measurements. We've been doing it for years, right? We have 5 years worth of data every 5 minutes for lots of domains on the internet. Something to the tune of billions of records, right? You're in there, right? So it could be an opportunity for us to do some work together, right?
All right, sounds good.
NIST, their monitoring is they have an official list of government websites, and they will dump that, and that's the only thing they are, quote unquote, specifically by policy allowed to monitor. And that's part of the 2010. But yeah, there are other ways of doing that. Any other questions?
All right, thank you.